Hello, my name is Matthew Kahn, and I'm the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you today about my new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. This book is joint authored with my friend Mac McComas, the Senior Manager of the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Our book explores the urban economics of 6 key American cities. These cities include Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. Our book is grounded in urban economics, but we also provide an urban history of these cities over the last 50 years. These cities, as I'll show you through a series of charts in a couple of minutes, have had a tough 50 years as they've deindustrialized. These were centers of manufacturing, creating opportunity for middle-class families, creating earnings. But as these cities deindustrialized, they have lost people and jobs, and poverty rates have gone up. Our book is not meant to be an urban history. It's actually set in the present and the future. But to understand the present and to think about the future of these cities, we need to understand the recent history of these cities. It is our belief that these cities are going to have to find their own solutions to escape the poverty challenge that they now face. In our post-COVID economy, both the federal government and the states have large budget deficits. It's unrealistic for these cities to believe that they can rely and wait for large federal and state transfers to bail them out. These cities are going to have to think about what they can do, what new rules of the game, what incentives can they introduce, what quality of life improvements can be introduced such that these cities do a better job competing with their suburbs and competing with more successful cities like Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. These cities compete for people and jobs. And how can they do a better job in this competition? Our book explores this key issue. And this is very important because of how many people continue to live in these cities and their children grow up in these cities. So what we're about to do is be realistic about the challenges these cities face, but also be optimistic about the opportunities that are possible if certain strategic investments are made by the public sector and the private sector that together could unlock the full potential of these cities and improve quality of life for the people who live in these cities. So our starting point is that these cities have been losing population. And throughout, we're talking about the center cities for these 6 cities, not the suburbs. These 6 cities in the year 1970 was home to 6.2 million people. During a time when the United States was growing in population, all 6 of these cities lost population. That means that people who didn't live in these cities were not moving to them, and incumbents in these cities were leaving. So 6.2 million people lived in these 6 cities in the year 1970, and only 3.9 million people lived in these cities in the year 2010. People are choosing not to live in these cities, sort of failing the market test. A major reason for population loss is a declining economy. These cities, especially Pittsburgh, was famous for steel, Detroit for cars. All 6 of these cities were manufacturing hubs in the 1950s and 60s. But it's ugly. From 1969 till the year 2018, Cleveland lost 75% of its manufacturing jobs. Philadelphia lost 92% of its manufacturing jobs. It's important to keep in mind that at the national level, which is that dotted blue line in the figure, the nation only lost 35% of its manufacturing jobs. So our 6 cities really had a tough time of deindustrializing. And that's why we have the words post-industrial in our title. The reason manufacturing jobs are so important is it's been well documented by labor economists that manufacturing jobs provide high-wage jobs for less educated people. Many African-American families had male members of the family working in manufacturing in these cities. And when these manufacturing jobs left these cities, there's a transition to the service sector. And intuitively, McDonald's does not pay as well as these manufacturing jobs. And as men lost well-paying jobs, there's a literature in urban sociology discussed by William Julius Wilson and others that men become less marriable. Women are less eager to marry them if they are not good breadwinners. And that part of the rise in poverty and part of the rise of female-headed households is due to declining prospects in the job market for men in these cities. Beyond manufacturing, other sectors of the economy in these cities did not grow well. So it'd be one thing in a Seattle if manufacturing declines, but there's a boom of Amazon and Microsoft and service jobs that are catering to the wealthy computer programmers there. Unfortunately, that did not occur in these cities. We see limited job growth in our cities because other sectors did not fill the void as manufacturing declined. And what this means is a higher poverty rate for our cities than for the nation as a whole. So what you see in this figure is a graph over time for our 6 cities, including Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, relative to the United States, which is the dashed blue line. You see that over time, the US poverty rate was roughly under 15%. But take a look at Detroit. For Center City, Detroit in 2010, with a poverty rate more than double the US average. Poor people, millions of people in these cities, roughly 1 million people in these cities are living in poverty. And they're choosing to not move away from these cities. And that makes it crucial, especially for the poor's children, to think about what can be done to improve economic opportunity in these cities such that the next generation of children have a chance to achieve their goals. Economists emphasize the importance of human capital, a fancy word for skill, and we often proxy for this using the share of adults that are college graduates. The good news for our 6 cities is you see across all of them a positive slope here. The share of college graduates is rising in all of these cities, but relative to the national average, Cleveland and Detroit, Cleveland, the mustard line, Detroit, the mustard line, and Cleveland, the silver line, are lagging the rest of the nation with roughly half the college graduation rate as the rest of the country. Cities that attract more skilled people have a larger tax base, and economists have argued that there's a number of spatial peer effects when you attract more skilled people to live in your city. More educated people are more likely to vote, more civically engaged, and more likely to be role models in communities. So this says that these cities, that there is a rise in college attainment over time in these cities, but with the exception of Pittsburgh, lagging the nation as a whole. One additional fact we present in the paper, in our book, is we studied poverty rates in the year 2010 across our cities within these cities. So at a distance of 0 to the city center, that's the center of the city. As distance to the city center increases to 8 miles, to 10 miles, to 12 miles, you're moving out into the suburbs. Notice that the lines we graph have a negative slope, and for Baltimore, it's fairly steep. This says that the poor, the highest concentration of the poor in our cities is actually at the city center. And as you move further and further from the city center, the share of poor people actually shrinks sharply. We find this very interesting. In other cities like San Francisco and New York City, rich people want to live at the city center. And yet here in these 6 cities, we're finding some of the highest rates of poverty at the city center. This raises questions of why and what could be achieved with policies to boost the city centers for these cities. In cities which are experiencing population loss, there's not much reason to build new housing. And we see that across our 6 cities relative to the nation as a whole, in recent years, there's been very little new housing supplied in these cities. That means that people who remain in these cities are living in older and older housing. That poses issues of lead exposure and of just living in low quality, depreciating housing. It is the case, as we've learned with brownstones in Harlem, that you can take older buildings and rehab them. But the propensity to want to rehab those buildings hinges on expectations of whether real estate prices are going to rise in such a city. If there's the expectation that real estate prices are going to decline, there are not strong incentives for real estate developers to invest. So expectations play a crucial role in determining whether real estate developers are going to try to borrow and access capital to invest in a city's real estate. We do a good job in the book documenting the home prices in our cities. For the United States as a whole, in the year 2020, the average home price was $260,000. Yet for our 6 center cities, much lower home prices, as low as $43,000 for the average home in Detroit, and $160,000 for the average home in Baltimore. What we're doing with this histogram that you see here is we are taking zip codes. So everyone with a postal code has a zip code. And we are graphing for our 6 cities the count of zip codes in each of these categories. There's only one zip code in our sample where the average home is more than $600,000. There are 27 zip codes where the average home sells in the year 2020 sells for less than $50,000. Folks, notice that there are many homes in our 6 cities where the average home price is less than $250,000. There's very few zip codes with expensive housing in our sample. What we want you to think about is does this mean when an urban economist sees low home prices, do you believe that there's no free lunch and that in a place featuring not much economic opportunity, home prices are going to be low? In a place with low quality of life, home prices are going to be low? Or do you see here opportunity that if you invest in Detroit now, that there are strategies that could take place if such a city unlocked its potential, such that you could make a fortune by betting on Detroit now at $43,000 a home and working as someone with a stake in that city after you purchase that asset, working to help the city to achieve its full potential. If we remake this figure in the year 2040, 19 years from now, will it look very different? Which of these 6 cities will have achieved their full potential? And for those cities that do, those who invested in real estate now will be rich. Another key factor of our 6 cities is the challenge of racial segregation. Here's what I see in these 2 figures. Census tracts are areas of roughly 4,000 people, and this is how the census often records data. For each census tract, we calculate the percentage of people in the census tract who are African American. Notice that in the year 1970, there was a very large number of census tracts, more than 700, that were less than 20% Black. Notice that there were very few census tracts, those 3 little bars that were integrated with large shares of Blacks and whites. And notice in 1970 that there was roughly 300 census tracts across our 6 cities with more than 80% African American. In the year 2010, notice that this trend continues, but it's changed a little bit. Notice that the tallest bar in the year 2010 is that there are over 500 census tracts in our 6 cities that are more than 80% Black. And notice that there are now just a little over 300 census tracts that are less than 20% Black. What this says to us is that these cities continue to be segregated. The typical census tract is either white or Black. Very few are integrated. Point number 2 is that overall across these 6 cities, whites have left these cities. Many have moved to the suburbs or they've moved to other cities. Whites have moved away from these cities is something that jumps out here. And of course, to an urban economist, the question is why? While the murder rate has declined in major cities like Los Angeles and New York in recent decades. Yes, in the year 2020, there was an uptick in murders in those cities. But a piece of great news for cities is that in major cities like New York and Los Angeles, the murder count has declined. A challenge that our 6 cities face is that the murder rate, the count of homicides each year in the city per 100,000 people, has remained much higher than the national average. You see for cities like St. Louis that it really bounces around. But for all of the cities, the homicide rate is much higher than for the nation as a whole. And the perception that these cities are dangerous and feature a higher murder rate acts to create a negative perception about these cities that affects tourism, and it affects the willingness of international tourists to visit and for people to send their children to the universities in these cities. The perception of violent crime is a key component of local quality of life, has key implications for how these cities compete. If a company like Amazon is thinking of locating an HQ2 in one of these cities, how does it approach the crime question? Does a fear of crime dissuade it from locating there? You get into questions of perception versus reality. If one of these cities enjoyed a crime reduction, would perceptions change? In this era of the internet, would it quickly become public knowledge that the city has grown safer? Or are there lags between perception and reality? Our book discusses these issues of how the 6 cities market themselves in the competition for people and jobs. So what we want to pivot to now is the 4 pillars of success of how you build up a great city, how you build up a great post-industrial city. And we want to think about the choices made by people, by the local government, by businesses, and by investors in the place itself, and how all of these feed in together to create a successful place where people can prosper and achieve their goals. First, it is paramount in all 6 of our cities that there be a commitment to investing in people and educating young children. Children do not choose their parents. And there's a question, we as a fair society and as a wealthy society at the national level face an imperative to help every child to achieve their full potential. My teacher, the Nobel laureate James Heckman, has emphasized the crucial role of parenting and the crucial role of early education for disadvantaged children. In Maryland, the Kirwan Report calls for a major investment in early education in children. In our book, Mac and I discuss this fundamental role of early human capital investment. The Nobel laureate Heckman says learning begets learning, skill begets skill. If young people get off to a good start in life, they're more likely to work and be contributing citizens and less likely to need social services in later life, whether those services are welfare or being incarcerated in the future. And so this question of how we as a society choose to invest more in our young people is essential. An issue that arises and which continues to be debated is whether we invest in public education or in private education for our young people. Is the public sector versus the private sector the right way to supply these skills that young people need? Throughout our book, Mac and I are honest about known unknowns versus unknown unknowns. I'm a fan of competition. I want to think of ways for our cities to both incentivize the public schools and to encourage private schools to experiment with different strategies for educating the young children, and let 1,000 flowers bloom for those programs that work. Statisticians like me and Mac will study these, document these, and once we have a good idea, other cities can try that out and see if you can export that good idea to another city. But what I do know is we need to experiment more with helping young children to achieve their full potential. Now, there's an ongoing question of what are the right investments in investing in young people. And at Johns Hopkins, there's interesting research that when African American children are taught by a Black teacher, that raises the probability of their success. There's questions of introducing better air conditioning in schools. There's questions of attracting higher quality teachers into the classroom, having better curriculum. We need to experiment with different strategies for improving urban education in these schools. And I'm hoping that our book stimulates some discussion about greater experimentation to learn what works. So in the midst of the COVID crisis, we've had this race, this Operation Warp Speed, to introduce these vaccines, and they've competed for market share. In a similar sense, we need more experimentation by public schools to figure out for different children what works, whether it's Khan Academy or different strategies to help these kids achieve their full potential, to learn to read. Jim Heckman has emphasized skills of grit and personality and perseverance, how we build up grit. These are key issues for the post-industrial city to make a comeback. Children are not the only ones. I turn 55 soon. I need new skills. How do we help middle-aged people to reskill? What college pathways can help those who've been displaced in other sectors to reinvent themselves? For those who served time in prison and have served their time and are coming back as returning citizens, they have rights to be reintegrated in the economy. What are strategies to help them achieve their goals going forward? Our book is sophisticated, talking through these issues of how to help everyone in these cities during the course of their life to achieve their life goals. And there's an optimism to research on human capital that this willingness to improve your skills and to compete in the marketplace, that there is an economic return to such investments. I think Mac and I do a very good job pointing out, we don't pick winners. We don't say, do this, this, and this, and you will be middle class. There's not a foolproof recipe here. Instead, we talk about different strategies cities have tried, and we talk about how to use statistical methods to evaluate these past efforts to see if they yielded good outcomes or just good intentions. And we talk about ways to judge whether you can extrapolate. If a program works in Baltimore, will it work in Detroit? Or are there reasons to think it won't? But we need to keep trying. A central issue in these 6 cities is the challenge of crime. And there are many strategies being partnered and piloted in these cities, such as ROCA and other programs to reduce the crime rate in these cities. We argue in the book that we need a scientific approach here to run formal field experiments here, where there's a treatment group and a control group to carefully analyze the cost effectiveness of different strategies. And post George Floyd, we need strategies that are respectful of the community, that affected communities support. Nobody wants to grow up in a high crime neighborhood, and nobody wants to live in a police state. There's very challenging libertarian and liberty issues of how we build up street safety while respecting people's personal rights. And I think that these issues, I'm very hopeful that the Biden administration will engage on these issues because I alluded to this earlier. If these cities can gain a better reputation for quality of life by reducing their gun violence, then this could go a very long way in unlocking the potential of these cities and creating new opportunities for their residents. Mac and I, in our 21st Century Cities initiative, spend a lot of time thinking about what are free market strategies to help local businesses and local African-American businesses in these cities achieve their full potential. Mac is an expert on access to finance in these cities. Our cities have some of the highest shares of Black-owned businesses, yet many of them remain small. We are getting ready to do a survey of these businesses, and we explore in the book hypotheses related to access to capital, a lack of collateral to offer to banks, which limits the ability to get loans on good terms, a a challenge of mentorship and role models for young entrepreneurs in knowing the ropes, and other barriers to entry of red tape and other just government rules that slow down the ability of small business people to launch their dreams. Our cities, there's so many opportunities in food and tourism and other possibilities if some of these barriers could be removed. We offer a case study here, Off the Rocks, a Black-owned wine shop in an upcoming neighborhood. And this is an example of a business that through some strategic investment is off to a good start. Mac and I want to study post-COVID, which of these businesses have been able to keep staying afloat, and what are their prospects going forward to create local jobs? Because as these businesses grow, they will hire more workers, and the workers they hire are likely to come from the city itself. And so there are these synergies between access to capital for small firms and creating private sector jobs for local people. If there could be this investment in skill, this investment in small businesses, real estate opportunities, recall that Zillow data I showed you before, could become much more profitable. Because of the history of past manufacturing in these cities have durable capital. Homes built in the 1950s are now 70 years old. If there isn't an incentive to maintain them, they're going to start to crumble. Cities like Baltimore and Detroit have tens of thousands of vacant buildings. Is this a challenge or is this an opportunity? If there is a perception that these cities are making a comeback as the cities become safer, as opportunities for education improve, as new urbanism rises, if there is the perception that there's a rising demand to live in these cities, real estate developers have strong profit incentives to begin to invest to upgrade the housing stock. There's sort of a Goldilocks issue here. As a city begins to gentrify, whether it's neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and we've seen this in Baltimore as well, rents start to rise. And there's a very interesting political economy challenge. I view rising rents in a city as a good thing. But I understand that if you're a poor renter and if your rent goes up by 50% because the neighborhood is in high demand, you might not be able to afford your old neighborhood. And so mayors in these cities have to figure out this Goldilocks effect. For long-term renters, do they have a stake in the city making a comeback? And Mac and I discussed this at length. Given my interest in environmental economics, I am fascinated and I'm a believer that investment in greening the city is a way to help these cities to unlock their full potential. The overhang of the industrial period is lead and degradation of land. Each of the cities is making investments to capitalize on its waterfront, to improve its air, and to turn vacant land into green space. Each of the cities has had high lead levels associated with lead paint and old housing, and exposure to high levels of lead greatly injures children, lowering the probability they achieve their full potential. So in my ongoing work on urban and environmental issues, I have argued that the Green City agenda is a pro-human capital agenda because you're more likely to attract skilled people to a beautiful place, and children who grow up in a beautiful place are more likely to be healthy and happy as they go along their journey. And so part of unlocking the potential of post-industrial cities is greening these cities. Mac and I talk at length in the book about our own personal excitement about the urban big data revolution. What big data does is it allows for a real-time report card. In this age of drones and smartwatches and smartphones, what I want to celebrate here is the ability for those who can access these data to have real-time information of what's going on in the city. So I love these examples of garbage cans that send a signal to the city's sanitation office when they're full with garbage. So in the past, garbage trucks didn't know which garbage cans were full or not. You can save money if you only pick up the garbage cans which are full with garbage. And so a garbage can with a smart sensor in it can say, hey, I'm full of garbage. And then the garbage is picked up. If you have multiple air pollution monitors throughout the city, you have much more information in real time about pollution hotspots. If you can measure the temperature in the city, across the city during spikes in the heat, you can know which areas of the city are suffering in a heat wave. These are examples of the urban big data revolution. From the school system, having access on which families' children have missed school in recent days and figuring out how to connect with a social worker to see what's going on with that family. So it's very important to avoid concerns about Big Brother and George Orwell, but it's also very important for the state to use its access to data to help families in need, almost like a diagnostic doctor, to diagnose who has a problem and then to think about cost-effective strategies for mitigating that problem. In a fair society, that's what government does for the people. So in thinking about our book, in a post-COVID economy and in an economy at the national level featuring more work from home, cities are going to face budget challenges. Poor people have suffered during the economic downturn. A silver lining of recent events in cities is that more immigrants are moving to cities. I'm optimistic that in the Biden administration, that there'll be a greater welcoming of immigrants to cities. And in some post-industrial cities, much of the population growth has not been native. It's been immigrants attracted by the low home prices. We continue to see young people wanting to live in cities. My son loves urban life. And in our new remote work economy, there's going to be more and more footloose people. For example, Washington, D.C. is now a very expensive housing market. Baltimore is 40 miles from Washington, D.C. I can imagine more and more work from home workers living in Baltimore where housing is much cheaper and then taking a train, taking Amtrak or the MARC 2 days a week to their office in Washington, D.C. In that sense, Baltimore becomes a type of suburb of Washington, D.C., and that helps to build up Baltimore's tax base, similar with Philadelphia to New York City. We see the superstar companies like Facebook building some campuses in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. They will consider the other 4 cities if they sense that quality of life is improving in those cities. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue here. I believe that if our 4 cities can make a strong case of improving along green city dimension, in reducing crime and improving local public institutions, including public schools, that you will see more work from home workers and more firms, especially firms seeking to hire a more diverse workforce, seeking out locations in our 6 cities. So to wrap up our book, to unlock the potential of post-industrial cities requires this coordination of young people investing more in their skills, government officials investing more in building a higher quality of life, safer cities, businesses investing and receiving more capital to build their businesses to hire more local people, and real estate developers taking a second look at these markets, seeing that home prices are cheap, purchasing land and property and rehabilitating them together. These 4 interdependent actors investing creates a stronger cities and improves the future quality of life of children born in these cities. Folks, if this has interested you, I hope you'll read chapter 1 of our book that's available there, and please email me your comments. Thank you very much.